Alright, is everyone good? The static conception of the family employed by the INA solidifies heteronormative and racist conception of familial relations. Hawthorne doesn't have use Christian law, focuses on the static conception of family and excludes different cultures. The idolized American family reflected a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant family. The statute reflects normative judgments about which family members belong in which category. The permanent PRR are not implementation with their grandparents' mission. The INA also does not recognize same-sex partners. Family relationships that fall outside of the traditional definition are unable to attain reunification. Likewise, queer immigrants are ineligible for visas under the family reunification policy, which clearly identifies and establishes the heteronormative nuclear family as the standard against which competing definitions of family are devalued and rejected. Lupine 2008. Current laws impede the status of citizens only because their sexual orientation, like family relationships, unrecognized. Their families endangered, their lives shattered by dislocation. These practices assault human dignity in an essential way. These hold as part of a wider network of queer experience involving the social political costs of partial citizenship and second finally costs of violence, which the habits of heterosexual privilege produce. These assaults materially articulate histories of racialization, sexism, neo-imperialism, and classism. The reproduction of national heteronormativity through border controls is connected with the wider neo-imperialist process. Immigration policies link heteronormative families with the war on terrorism through manufacturing loyal heteromasculine soldiers who participate in global warfare. The policing of the queer body by immigration exclusion is the basis by which the state polices the sexuality of the ideal American citizen. Lupine 2005. Immigration exclusion is marked U.S. certain citizens to others. The states that control the very populations or key technologies through which the nation and sovereignty get reconstructed. The scholarship, lesbian, gay exclusions, when people labeled as psychopathic inferiors first bar of entry to the United States, INS, used the ban on psychopathic personalities as grounds for including men and women whom they thought were homosexual. Lesbian gay relationships are not recognized as a legitimate basis for acquiring LPR status. Lesbian gay exclusions never functions as an isolated system, but instead as part of a broader federal immigration control regime that sought to ensure improper sexual and gender war, reproduction of white racial privilege, and exploitation of the poor. The immigration system became transformed into an apparatus for regulating sexuality in relation to shifting gender, racial, ethnic, and class anxieties. The INA's static definition of family is directly in line with modern technology and its ways to eliminate difference in an impossible quest for ontological certainty and an objective grounds for identity construction. Garlic in 2003. Modern technology is an important gender dimension in framing is manifested in a rational calculative attitude towards the world by anything is ordered to stay by its resource. The danger is that this framing conceals that revealing which lets where the presence comes forth. The analysis of activity but then becomes the only possible mode of revealing. Diminishing human freedom, there is something masculine and modernity style for rationalization, order, and control, and framing can explain the very existence of masculinity and its relationship to heterosexuality. Modern science has on the intersexual body and demands that it reveal itself in unambiguous fashions of the hermaphrodite can be classified and ordered according to the ideal. The modern technology of sex challenges forth the body's true sex according to a standardized framework. Truth is thought of in terms of the certainty of gravity of the autonomous human subject. Science reveals human beings as objects which can be separated from the world and known objectively, and masculinity and femininity represent a particular form of the gender metaphysics. The modern technological thinking allows men to be equated with one another as human resources which can be endlessly swapped about. A subject that requires masculinity or femininity is a heterosex subject. It is a historical sex body as posited by biology that has been understood as the epistemic foundation for the social order. Scientists regard it a political process over power and the position and even most fear. Sexual politics over the right to dominate the public sphere are behind this process. Gender and sex are important to sustain inequalities. The human being is now the subject that grounds the truth of the world. These concepts of gender work to standardize human subjects. The heterosexualization of modern society trying to form specific mechanisms of knowledge and power centering on sex. Both economic and sexual activity came to be framed according to a way of being oriented towards the production of order itself. The invention of heterosex created a need to enforce heterosexuality so that one could be all. They police heteronormativity as the representatives of a modern technological understanding of our being. Modern technology is a movement towards the absence of difference. This anxiety over the groundlessness of modern existence is self-perpetuating. Both radical ontological insecurity results from the revealing the world as merely state preserve. The condition must manifest itself most notably in our attitude towards death. This basis for Hobbes' political philosophy is to be found in the belief that everyone shuns death. Heterosexuality installs biological reproduction as a teleological ground of our human being, a scientific response to the death of God, and an edge hard of the specter of death. The current criteria for family-based visas forces the immigrant to repress the sexual identity of their bodies for entry. Garlic in 2010. The establishment of oppositional categories, heterosexual difference, and expressive categories can be understood as products of modern technology. The body is inframed by technology of sex and force challenged forth and secured within a natural order that seeks only to reproduce the same. Our gender order would thus be a technological response to the challenging form of framing, and framing is presented itself as the only possible mode of revealing, acts to block other possible disclosures, and they diminish our ability to recognize the very processes of revealing that is taking place. It blocks difference. The priority of presence transforms the desire, since it becomes a desire for a certain absence, for the withdrawal from finitude. This flight from presence expresses itself through the denial of singularity, the rejection of coming to presence, and the refusal to acknowledge the multiplicity. This employment of categories that refers to a presence that is never allowed to come to be. Modern technology is directed towards moving objects from time to time and fixing them in place. This form of forced presencing is a precondition for all forms of xenophobia and totalitarianism. This is Campbell 99. Natural socialism, bloody barbarism was not to be found in aberration of reasoning, but rather in the essential possibility into which we can be led by logic, and against which philosophy not sufficiently injured itself. Possibility of evil as a product of reason, which is called the ontology of transcendental idealism. This subject is therefore before all else we should be free, and think itself free. Ethics is most often understood in terms of moral codes of autonomous ages. Political totalitarianism rests on ontological totalitarianism, in which truth is equivalent to presence and intelligibility. They consider the truth to be that which is present, that which can be gathered, and to totality, that which is other, is thereby reached the same. Antisemitism is more than hostility, felt by a majority towards a minority, no xenophobia, no racism. It can be understood as A repugnance felt for the unknown within the psyche of the other, for the mystery of his interiority, or repugnance felt for the pure proximity of the other man, for societies have resolved that its government should no longer find family, for the purposes of returning beneficial eligibility for family-based visas, as Pezzi explains resolved in 2006. In Gillespie, we found that our will is a resolve, and this resolve must be letting itself be called forth. It is quite difficult to think of resolve. It is not a matter of will to pursue an action. It is not the gathering of energy to be released into action. Resolve should be the opening of a man, particularly undertaken by him for openness. Intersecting forms of racial, gender, and heteronormative oppression are actualized through technological reduction of identity to binaries. Only the ontological criticism of the affirmative can sever these binary modes of being and solidify material hierarchies of oppression and meaning in 2009. Mindless ontology permeates research methodologies on binary constructs and a way that maintains sexual and gender dynamics. Researchers fill the question of dualistic nature. Inherent certain methodologies, physical and political hierarchies are perpetuated. Ontologies that embrace complexity are useful in producing queer methodologies that continuous deconstructible knowledge, claiming objectivity, races, sexuality, classified and strong deviant knowledge, and objects, so the necessity of the other is an ontological one, but the whole conglomeration of sciences and disciplines, specific sciences, these classifications are objective for the suggestion that they are removed from all social, cultural, political influences. Such as for its objectivity, produce patriarchal knowledge, or work against knowledge of the reality of gender relations. Objectivity, the term given to men's subjectivity, to work against subjectivity, and research necessary for methodologies of subjectivity should become unstable, or should stay a clear identification within the inside or outside of polarity, situating would not only reorganize the researcher-subject, research-object relationship to be one that is non-hierarchical, but material experience reality. Cursive activities can lay claim to knowledge previously made deviant and invisible to exposed technologies of making normal, to poke holes in the hegemonic understanding that have classified, persecuted, and killed us. A queer ontology challenges modern identities of binary, stable categories, biological racism, long been the handmaidens of racism, just as those about gender were a central part of sexism. Discourses of race and gender buttress one another, overlapping and shaping models of homosexuality, methodologies that drove dominant ideologies to the pursuit of knowledge about the homosexual body, the ultimate evidence generated from the aesthetic, academic, and policy research on tools of advanced government and liberal governmentality, querying the orientation of the researcher would support phenomenology as a core methodology. Only an ontological perspective can reveal the socially mediated nature of all seemingly material foundations of identities, as Garlick in 2003. One might be tempted to conclude that masculinity can be summarily dealt with, but possibly shows deconstruction. The problem is that we have no set of criteria for identifying how many distinct masculinities are present. If masculinities exist, then we should be able to identify them as things which are attempted to be themselves. It is by no means clear that masculinities have the emergent status of their present and avoiding empirical classification. Clonard assimilates the position back to the positivistic projection of providing empirical analysis of masculinity. Clonard claims talking about men will give us access to social facts of the objectification of power. The belief that we can separate males as the objective reality distinct from the mystification of masculinity, system, gender identity, is a fundamentally mistaken one. To believe that one can simply dispense with the technology of gender in favor of programs and actions in the real material world is to subscribe to a technical solution which remains trapped within the framework of modern technology. McKinnis mobilizes and reaffirms crucial aspects of masculinity, even as he attempts to deny it. We misunderstand the danger of modern technology and masculinity if we see it as a middle to technical solutions. The threat is not a problem for which we must find a solution, but an ontological condition that requires a transformation of our understanding of being. The underlying tenets of the modern regime become untouched. Finally, only an ontological lens can effectively disrupt the hegemonic forms of knowledge to make macro violence inevitable. This is Burke in 2007. War is not a neutral and rational instrument of policy. It's the product of hegemonic forms of knowledge about political action and community. Violent ontologies dominate policy frameworks. Standing for parties related reason. The framework views come to standing for being as other framing drives out every other possibility of revealing. The challenge is posed not merely by government policy, but by an overarching system of thinking that lays claim to our truth of existence. Militarism, oppression, economic explanation, and ecological destruction derived not merely from particular choices by policymakers, but from calculated empirical discourses of scientific and political truth rooted in powerful and enlightened images of being. Confined with this principological universe, policymakers' choices become necessities. Their actions become inevitabilities. Human suffering and irrationality builds on one structure of truth on another to a course of action becomes preordained. Principle of discourse constraints and material constraints that derive from mutually reinforcing cascade of discourses which create a militarism and violence and necessary policy responses. I have 45 seconds. Something for me to read a card? Okay.
What is the United States federal government?
Our Burke evidence explains that the United States federal government is actually only an affect of the types of knowledges that we produce in micro collections like this debate round.
So why do you start there?
We don't start there by any means. We say that we should think a scenario where the United States federal government necessarily allows for people that are terrorists to get visas. We say that that is productive because it allows for us to highlight, as opposed to...
I thought it was about queerness.
About queerness? What did I say?
In a relationship as a family.
What did I say? Did I say terrorists? Oh, I'm thinking about the old F. Sorry about that. Yeah, our argument is about that. Totally. Sorry about that. Yeah, our argument is that we imagine that those people who are currently excluded from status quo conceptions of family have visas and that they have the ability to come in. Our argument is
so what's the starting point of the F?
The F? I don't think we'd agree that there's a starting point at any point. We have a net benefit to the presentation of the 1AC.
What is
we have not, we don't have, what?
What is that net benefit?
Our argument is that the reading of the 1AC necessarily interrupts the dominant ontology that states that there is a definite construction of what a family is, and that needs to be enforced through things like border controls and the ways that define family-based visas and eligibility. We say that is the benefit to the affirmative, and that is why voting affirmative is an affirmation. The voting affirmative is an act of political dissent.
About the 1AC, like, disrupted that dominant narrative?
Our argument is that the introduction, I suppose it's the introduction of knowledge. We read knowledge in a certain way that is against the grain of the dominant understanding of knowledge, against the dominant ontology, in such a way that it highlights the cracks and fissures.
I don't get any of that.
What do you not get? Our argument is that right now, people believe that if not just all people in general.
I'm just trying to figure out why the YAC is key to break down the dominant narrative.
What do you mean by key? We think that it's productive. We don't think it's the end-all, be-all of all forms of social relation, or even to break down familiar relations. We simply believe that in this debate round, we have a responsibility for the discourses and the knowledges that we produce. And we have taken responsibility for those and said, while the discourses and knowledges we have produced are good, because they interrupt the hegemonic.
So does every individual have their own ontology?
What do you mean every individual have their own? We don't think that ontology is something that you have in that sense. We instead believe that the way you think about the world and your material existence in the world are co-constitutive insofar as I have experience. Right, let me explain. That's what I was going to. That means that the way you live in the world makes you think about things and think about yourself in a particular way. But the way that you think about things also conditions.
The way you live in the world?
The way you live in the world necessarily influences how you come to understand ideas. Like, if I live in the world and people tell me that I'm a certain color or a certain gender, right, that's going to influence how I see myself. But at the same time, if I think about myself in a different way, or I think about those people in a different way, that can also influence my interaction with materiality. The two things, co-constitutive means they constitute one another. They work together to become what is experience, what is knowledge
why
of
is it
itself.
necessary to vote F then?
Because are you asking like what the impact of that is? We've said what the F does. The impact of that is our Campbell evidence, which indicates that we need to interrupt the construction of the family in static ways that force the immigrant to oppress themselves, because that's the foundation for. That is in and of itself an act of ontological violence towards the immigrant.
Our criticism of the affirmative is rooted in a method of interaction with the state. As the people have become some of the most disempowered and capable units of productivity that have been handicapped by what the United States federal government should do for us in the debate space, from the perspective of a person raised in a highly urbanized neighborhood that throughout my adolescent life expressed highly publicized pleas to improve everything from a consistently corrupt school district to a horribly ineffective police department. We pled for them to pay attention to a broken spirit community who had no faith in the system, who had no faith in them. As a child of a mother who has worked for the city of Kansas City, Missouri for the past 39 years, and a person forced to debate about what the United States federal government should do for the people, I ask what anyone would. Where's the government in all of this? Where are the people whose faces interrupt my favorite primetime TV shows? They kiss babies and pat heads when it was convenient for their agendas. What happens when the state and its constituents have no direct benefit in attending directly to the people? Ask my mother that question. The one who started serving her community by cleaning public pool toilets at the age of 14. The one who was organized back to school rallies annually that guaranteed at least 5,000 kids school supplies for their first day. The one who hosted youth empowerment workshops in the community center. She's the director of located 3 blocks either way from the 2 largest projects in our city. The same one who single-handedly oversees the transportation, food jobs, clothes jobs, and public research information dispersed for at least 800 sick and shut-in families and people throughout the year. I asked her where the government was, and her response was simple. They're where they've always been, doing what they've always done, making sure that their families never miss a meal, ensuring that their kids have the school supplies that they need, making certain that their young people will be ready for the world that they'll be handed, and convincing people who will never live in their world that if it can work for them, it can work for us too. Ultimately, we should not succumb to the institutional demands of our professional lives. It is our obligation as ethical actors to break out the logic of doubling, or the idea that we are not responsible when higher powers like the topic committee, traditional debate, and literal interpretation of the resolution tell us what to do. The alternative is a form of political imagination that cannot conceive of difference. This is fashion can no one. The modern period, which began with utopian hope that science and technology will create an age of peace, prosperity, and progress, ending the apocalyptic nightmare of mass death symbolized by Auschwitz and Hiroshima, leaving us with the task of creating a postmodern ethic that can transcend the techno-bureaucratic tribalism that expresses itself in 2 world wars. The undermining of ethical consciousness by techno-bureaucratic organization through a psychological process of doubling, separating one personal and professional identities, which enables individuals to deny that they're responsible for some of their actions, encourage one to engage in a total surrender of self and unquestioning obedience to a higher authority, so that when one acts as a professional self on behalf of an institution, i.e. the state, the military, the church, etc., one can say it's not I that acts, but a higher authority is acting through me, so I cannot be personally responsible. Make no mistake about it, this debate will come down to social location and method and the ways that one dictates and illuminates the other. Social location cannot be separate from the ideologies it embraces. It is no secret that Heidegger was an overtly adamant Nazi that vehemently worked to kill the queer body, both theoretically and literally. If we are to embrace the ontological conceptualizations of the one they see, we must look at the disconnect between understanding being and embracing being, which is where we find the discrepancy of the affirmative. Heidegger hated queers, Jews, and black people, which forces and begs the question of how the app intersects with the black experience. Hundreds of people every weekend I see, and for barely for any of them to ever look like me is just implicitly complicit in their intention to miss it. The mission will miss the missionary, so we get done the traditional way. Let's call it a missionary. I see people take off and it's face off that want me to take my race off. And the other factors of race that daily affect me, and the ways being a black woman in this space perplex me, and how when I'm in their faces to speak on it, they respect me, but when they construct plans of action, they never seem to reflect me. So conservative utilitarian calculations, they short circuit the ability to shake the bullshit, no palpitations, just amalgamations of their agendas and their effects on the people. Hell bent on making a miracle appear without a church or a steeple missing the mark. So if you're trying to spark it, I'm gonna be the flame, go from being shut up to being shamed and finally screaming my name because it's forgotten the monotony of what it means to create change. And to see how my people's perspectives can bring light to the darkest of days. Flip the switch, because I tell you, I'll be the son of a snitch before the bastard daughter of political passivity. See, I'm gonna crack the world twice before it takes another dirty swing at me. And it's gonna be what it's gonna be, because we come to paint your ivory towers black again. Because my hope won't let me leave, and my pride won't let my pride won't stop my pride, because my pride won't let my pride stop my pride from crashing in. Stand still, I will not, I'll stand from the hilltop. I don't care if you say stop, because I'm looking for the black people. Without understanding the connection between the family and the state in the context of structural violence and the black experience, their method becomes one that ignores the ways people of color come to value and access their method. Ultimately, what this argument says is that when you look at the understanding of the state from the context of a black person, you have to understand, especially from even my social location, how it is that I come to understand these two things. When I think about family, I think about the state, I think about how the state essentially rips apart families. I think Ryan can specifically talk about the fact that queering the lines between family does nothing for the black experience when we come to understand what it means to be a family in the first place. When that third and fourth cousin is sleeping on your couch even though you don't really know them because they have nowhere to go and their social locations and limitations allow for them to have to come together and reconceptualize what it means when the state interacts with the family. You have to reconceptualize the ways in which the black experience wins to this. That's ultimately like the notion of what is this example that I was given when you look at notions of blackness and the black psyche. The question was posed: what is a prison within a prison within a prison? The answer is the United States. The prison inside the United States and ultimately solitary confinement. But then it goes a step further and asks again: what is a prison within a prison within a prison within a prison? That's the United States federal government. The United States, a prison within the United States, solitary confinement, and that is, my friend, is where you find that fourth prison, which is the black mind. The black mind that cannot be accessed by methodology that prioritizes the ontology or the perspectives of ontology from a person who told us that the black experience must die. That leaves us in solitary confinement and has no way to access the black mind and the black conceptualization of what it means to be a family and what it means when that family interacts with the state. That's something that they cannot access, and something that throughout this round you understand that their methodology is one that precludes in the conversation about how it is we ought to act in juxtaposition to state action. And how it is we come to understand the state. Wise impacts this when he says personal principles don't matter because winning is all that matters. I learned a lot about a lot of issues, but I'm mostly challenged by the activity itself. If I learn anything from debate, is almost only the research phase of the operation because the actual debate is pretty much hour after hour, possibly mental masturbation. I say this process is white because in my experience it appeals to the way white folks, especially the affluent ones that can typically afford to debate, view the world and equally seem to plug into people of color for the same reasons. They have the luxury of looking at life and death issues of war, peace, famine, unemployment, and criminal justice. It's simply a game of winning is all that matters. That contextualizes to you the inaccessibility of their method to the black family, to people who will come to understand what notions of family from a different perspective that cannot necessarily access the perspective of a Nazi that told us that black people essentially die. I can't understand my being if my being is being erased and eradicated by somebody who does not stand in solidarity with that notion of being in this existence in context and in confrontation with the state. And that's something that, again, their methodology cannot access. The conversation I had with my mother was impactful. When we ignore the power dynamic attached to instances of oppression, we attach global solutions to highly localized issues. The disconnect between the state and the people whose discourse affects these type of circular policies to turn these type of debates into revolving doors instead of doorways to societal advancement. Ultimately, we cannot understand the structures of oppression by thinking about them abstractly. We must heed the perspectives of the oppressed in order to investigate the complex relations of power and domination and how they exist in society. It's only by supplementing our perspectives with those of others that we can best figure out how to act in the world this is hands. Starting off from the oppressor's use for grounding the knowledge of outsiders seeking to understand their own complex relationships and systems of oppression. Outsiders cannot simply investigate the effects of oppressive power structures in our own lives. On the contrary, their relationship to the oppressor requires them to understand the systems of oppression from the perspective of the oppressor, producing the less partial awareness of the matrices of power as well as the specific relationships with those matrices. Only by becoming conscious of these experiences can I properly understand my contribution to the power structure. Without working to understand that perspective, my own partial perspective is ineffectual, but by supplementing my perspective with theirs, I'm able to make better informed choices about my own actions. Actions are that what are those papers that we had here? Actions that resist or contribute to the oppression that I mainly witnessed secondhand. The standpoint of the oppressor is necessary to manage our own involvement with systems of oppression so as to most effectively combat oppression as a systematic yet particular effective power. Ultimately, in the 1AC, they read this. Yeah. They read this piece of Manning evidence, but it talks about lived experience and how important that lived experience is in the context of affirming what it is that they say that we have to stand in solidarity with. But they don't even recognize lived experiences, which their Manning evidence talks about as the best way to interrogate queerness. The Manning evidence says that phenomenology looks to describe the lived experience or the essence of phenomenon. For research methodology, queering the orientation of the researcher or calling into being a queer ontological perspective would support phenomenology as a queer methodology. The question is not so much finding a queer line, but rather asking what our orientation toward queer movements of deviation will be. Ultimately, the movement toward a deviation conversation from the non-queering of the United States federal government in the context of visa policies, one that cannot be had, and a productive conversation about it cannot be had until we put the lived experience at the focal point, at the forefront of how it is to become to understand and interrogate these different instances. When I was 4 years old, I learned to tie my shoes, learned to christen, the cross, and the thread, and the loop, and the pull, and the tug until it fit right. Imagine little on me and my highlights, the shoes that flared at the bottom. With every step taking me towards the places I needed to be, the free world at my toes, and so I thought it. More distraught by the pressure of being all tied up in public, I struggled at home to make sure that I had it all right. All the lines intertwined to hold my feet in. Sink or swim, walk or run, my shoes would be connected. The foundation grounded in the soles, the uniqueness found on the sides, but the laces are what made the shoes purpose complete. For what good is support if it cannot be the same, the disdain of a child. Ready to treat the world as my personal playground, ready to run and to jump and to play with the best of them. But sometimes my shoes just wouldn't stay tied just like the rest of them. So I learned to double knot. I'm taking what was truly one string and treating like the many it appeared to be. The manifestation of the simile is like what I've seen in my lifetime. The overlapping of a Toya Williams green, the weaving together of Toya G, and the crossing over of T, and the pulling through whatever else I answer to. The task easily undone if they're not secure, and too easily undone if they're to fly independently. Pulling tight on my experiences, looping everything in with everything I aspire to be, and at that point I'm liberated. The free world at my toes, with every step taking me toward the places I needed to be. At 21 years old, I learned to tie my identities, the christen, the cross, and the thread and the loop, and the pull and the tug until it fit right. Now you take a walk in my shoes. Ultimately, what this means is that in contextualization of how it means and what it means to understand their culture is not inaccessible when it comes to understanding oppression, and how the oppression on the queer family is one that's not recognized by an intersection approach by the affirmative. That ultimately means that they have no solvency in this round, and they have not had the proper starting point in grappling with notions of oppression.
Real fast before I start, can I get the cards that you read so I can hand them to you?
The top.
The top one, and then I got all the other ones? Or is it this
Oh,
one?
and then this. Well, we read y'all man in it.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, how do you know the 1AC had no lived experience in it?
Because it wasn't explicitly pointed out. What a lived experience.
Because it wasn't explicitly pointed out?
Yeah.
Well, why does it have to be explicitly pointed out?
Our argument, and even your argument, talks about the fact that when lived experience is a part, I think, okay, I'll connect the two arguments. Number one, the humanity evidence talks about the lived experience that must be a part of, part
we
and
said
parcel
that
of your
lived
methodology,
experience
right?
is
And
part of
then
our knowledge and speech. Why does that mean I have to come out and say, well, I had this one experience, and that's what informed my decision to read this in this round, that's why I wrote these tags this way, etc. Why do I have to come out and tell you that?
we say that's an important perception of representational politics.
Why do you have the right to tell me I need to say that?
Excuse me?
Why do you have the right to tell me I need to say that? I need to come out and tell you why I need to write my text a certain way or why I did that.
It's an accessibility question.
What does that mean?
It means that in order to gain accessibility, number one, we have to confront our identities and how
I don't know what
they-
that means. My question is, why do you have the right to tell me and Nick that we need to tell you why we wrote our 1AC the way we did?
If you ask me the same question over and over again, my answer probably won't change. If you let me finish the answer, our answer is, in the context of representational politics and how we come to understand and situate ourselves in the interconnections of different people's identities, especially in the space when we're talking about ontology or the state of being, we have to come to understand those states of being and how they interact with our own
Right,
position.
understand.
That is why.
But your whole argument is a narrative about yourself. So why do we, in order to understand our sense of being, since obviously your argument is about your sense of being, why do we have to reveal
Our argument
ourselves
about our
to you
sense of
in that
being
context?
as it relates to other senses of being, i.e. the affirmative that exists inside of this round. In order for us to understand and
Alright,
interact
that's
with the
fine.
affirmative, we have to understand our own
Let's
position.
talk about your Heidegger as a Nazi arguments. Fashing is a member of the Christian church. Are you responsible for all of the acts of the Christian church?
No.
Then why are we responsible for an author that we don't read, but is just referenced in part of his argument in one piece of evidence?
I mean, I think it's going to be debatable when you talk about ontology and the state of being and the intersection of
Other
identity.
people talk about ontology besides Heidegger, right?
Explain the correlation if it's an argument then. How did the
Start from the
1AC
beginning. We
implicit
want
in
the
Nazi
explanation
politics?
of correlation between what and what.
The 1AC in Nazi politics, because it's kind of offensive.
You said Heidegger hates Jews, queers, and black people.
No, I said Nazism opposed the hating of Jews.
So what does that have to do with us?
And black people.
What does that have to do with us?
You all use an ontological perspective from a Nazi. You say that that's bad because, again, social
You
opinions
use an
cannot be
ontological-
severed. Social, okay, and that can be
He's a
something to
Nazi?
debate
That
about.
is
We'll
the
probably
ex-
argue that the impacts of Nazism may even be.
Okay.
Well,
That's
I
fine.
won't even say that. I won't
Let's
even
move
say
on.
that.
Let's move on. I have one more question and one at a time.
Okay.
You say ontology is not something that's accessible by the black mind.
No, I said your form of ontology is one
Why,
that's accessible. Not
why is our
ontology
form
in
of
general.
ontology not accessible?
For the same reason that we criticize Heidegger for his...
Exactly. You say that all Heideggerian ontology is inaccessible by the black mind. How is that true when people like Franz Fanon have adopted very similar concepts when they self-identify
I
as
don't
like a
know
black
who the
man?
person is that you reference, so maybe better contextualization for me would help.
He's a person that identifies as...
I didn't know that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. about is to actualize queer methodology by politicizing the debate space and the ways in which voting and dissenting against and reading politics against the grays has an effect of revealing cracks and fissures in hegemonic forms of thought, which directly result in macro-scale violence and exclusion, such as the exclusion of the immigrant based on the static definitions of family. In the status quo, Burke evidence sets up the interpretation for what coalesces is the biggest proximate cause into macro-level exclusion. Burke evidence indicates that macro-level exclusion is not the result of rational choices made by policymakers, but is precisely, but is informed by their social situatedness, is informed by certain ontological assumptions that they make about the world, i.e. the rational actor would not make the rational choice to conflict and confine the definition of family if they had not made the first ontological assumption that the family can be staticized, because precisely it is rooted in identity, which is constantly shifting. If they had a queer rendering and understood themselves to be a queer methodological figure and embodying a queer subjectivity, they wouldn't have made those arguments in the first place. Now, this means that the 1AC did have a social location. The 1AC was a process of queering debate by focusing on and changing the focus of the debate from a traditional instrumental government or policy and shifting the debate towards the ways in which ontological assumptions shape and have come to overdetermine the immigration practice. Remember, our argument is not that we should just turn our backs on debate, but that we should challenge and open up the cracks and fissures and show the ways in which debate has the same propensity to coalesce into the same types of hegemonic forms of thought that are problematic in society writ large. Now, our strategy is actually better. Than turning our backs on the debate space. Reading the 1AC was an act which recognized the uncanniness of the plain text. Reading the plain text was an act of resolve, which utilized the tools of hegemonic forms of debate and traditional instrumental debate against themselves, and asks you to totally reconfigure yourself and understands the ways in which a different interpretation of resolve can radically reconfigure the ways in which we understand ourselves, not only just the resolution, but how we are situated in debate, which is another reason for why ideological and ontological assumptions we make, even about language itself, comes to determine the ways that we socially locate as debaters. Now, our one piece of 1AC evidence, our manic and our garlic evidence, are very good on the question of why technology as a form of knowledge production, which correlates truth with co-presence, that which is present is thus objectively true, is problematic because it enframes the world and reduces it to the sovereign game of an ego which stands over and above it, withdrawn from the social location, and can thus challenge forth and withdraw and pull out and frame truth claims from those around them. Now, this is precisely what the Immigration Service in INA does when it challenges forced sexuality from the immigrant body and challenges forced a genealogical investigation of their familial relationships. This is precisely what the visa system does when it forces the immigrant to either self-identify with either being straight or homosexual, and forces them to reveal themselves in terms of having immediate family relationships. This means that our queer methodology allows us to permute the different roles of the ballots and different methodologies, and recognize that truth is always a constant process of negotiating the ways in which revealing and concealing is the proper rendering of truth, which shatters truth as co-present, and recognize the ways that there is no metaphysical center to politics, that no one social strategy will be able to remedy exclusion in every social situation. The problem is whenever we forget that our revelations always come with a concealing fact. Likewise, a queer methodology allows us to see the intersections between different forms of social exclusion. Morrison 2K7. Heterosupremacy and white supremacy are interconnected, fundamental to perpetuation, dominant, subordinate social theory. Principles of ideology, including heterosupremacy and white supremacy, are interconnected, differently operationalized depending on multiple identities, subordinated groups, sexuality, race, class, and inequality are not separable but conflicting systems of subordination are mutually beneficial to one another. The racism and heterosexual convergence support a particular group's dominance, grouping the most dominant characteristics, which strives towards constructs a field, subordinates those who specify specific characteristics of racial whiteness and heterosexuality. This speaks to racialized, sexualized gender, and class aspects of dominant sex, subordinate binary. White women access some racial benefits. Similarly, interracial heterosexual couples, while possibly disadvantaged by virtue of being interracial, are able to access marriage benefits. Heterosupremacy is an oppressive force within communities of color. The failure to work against one helps to ensure that the other's continued strength. Failure to adhere to an anti-heterosupremacy principle serves to help maintain white supremacy. The racism at the core of white supremacy and the heterosexism and homophobia at the core of heterosupremacy are interconnected and interdependent. Racism, heterosexuality, and homophobia connect, along with classism, sexism, and other subordinating ideologies, to form a elitism that maintains white supremacy continues to exist today. Our queer methodology is one that constantly disturbs politics and will disturb the attempt to center any methodology, and ensures that whenever we are overly focused on the binaries and the ways in which bodies are racially marked. It cannot account for the ways in which exclusion happens upon those bodies which are not marked at all. The queers who are necessarily forced into the closet by any strategy which attempts to challenge forth a social location, which means that the alternative has gone too far in demanding that the 1AC reveal itself and allowed to be challenged forth by the call of the 1AC to reveal its social location. We can recognize that the 1AC did have a social location and spoke and has its unique history. However, its inability, its strategy of frustrating the gaze of technology, which constantly challenges it forth, is a strategy which frustrates the politics of the closet, which has overdetermined the status quo. It's precisely the same reason for why whenever someone comes out of the closet, they are always presumed in every other social relationship after that that they were back into the closet. You can't just come out once and for all. You have to constantly do it over and over again. Now, the ontology is necessary for understanding these impulses because it is functionally the same ontological impulse at work in the immigration system, just draped in a liberal garb, which is precisely why technology becomes so, why technology is so dangerous that it's able to depoliticize itself by blood throwing, by throwing blood on the situation and the historical relationship that it attempts to negate in terms of coming with a dialectical or an inversion, i.e. the lack of social locatedness in modern colorblind politics cannot be remedied by inverting that and demanding social location out of every subsequent policy. What is missed is the same impulse to extract and stand over and above such objects and withdraw from them the experience, which is particularly telling whenever they assumed that the 1AC had no lived experience because it was not explicitly stated by the 1AC. You should affirm the lived experience that remains concealed in the 1AC as a strategy which disrupts the technological gaze, which remanifests itself in a more depoliticized garb. Our Campbell evidence indicates that this form of first presidency is directly responsible for the consular, which challenges for sexuality as a form of ontological violence, which is constitutive of all forms of totalitarianism and is a form of xenophobia that is atrocious precisely because it fears all forms of difference, in any different types of social, in any types of different social remedy. Now, the whole discussion of starting point and end point is also telling that their politics is functionally binary. Engaged in binary logic, it is functionally dialectical, and we have to stop that. We have to stop that. Now, the question of accessibility is one which cannot be remedied or universalized outside of the debate space. We chose to speak the way we are because we have the privilege that everyone in this room has the privilege of being at a debate tournament and being able to recognize that we do have the ability to think about the world and take a step back from the material constraints and the work that is imposed on us by society writ large. But we should use our privilege as debaters and the audience that affords us to speak about world in certain ways. Just like the 1AC would not be accessible to all people because even social theory is novel to racists, and even their representational politics would not mean anything if extracted from the broader project of the 1AC. The 1AC doesn't have any endpoint or any endpoint or end goal, and is crucial for students. Students to recognize that identity is always a queer identity. Kramer Doll 96. Experience is crucial political term. The notion of voice that calls forth the teachers and students to find their own voices is running the same essentialist epistemological assumptions for years. Assume that speaking the authentic voice that has in sounds of traditional pedagogic practices can make themselves audible and become the authors of their own world. The metaphor itself assumed to be self-evident, left unexamined. Critical pedagogy acknowledges the possibility of each student being able to locate a variety of authentic voices, but this moves to pluralization, loses sight of the contradictory partial nature of all voice critical pedagogy, not confronted with the ways in which individual students' voices already a teeth-gritting and often contradictory intersecting voices constituted by gender, race, class, ability, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ideology, nor does it engage with the fact that particularities of historical context and personal biography in which voice is split considers the unconscious will necessarily render each expression of student voice partial and predicated on the absence of marginalization of all alternative voices.
Okay, so just as a reminder, what does affirmative ballot represent?
It represents a political act of dissent against the technology instantiated in peace and debate.
I missed the beginning, I'm sorry. Political what?
It means to acknowledge the ballot as dissent against technology.
So what was your role in the ballot argument? Is that the same thing?
It was to actualize queer methodology through politicizing the debate round.
Okay, so you make a permutation. What is this permutation?
Well, the permutation, it's not like a traditional permutation. It says that we have to use the method, queer methodology, in order to prevent any social strategy from calcifying and inverting metaphysics, inverting the strategy that it seeks to overcome.
Okay. You make an argument about starting point and end point are bad in the context of the alternative? Like, what was the argument?
End point implies starting point, and starting point implies end point.
Right.
The whole process of queer methodology is one that doesn't have a beginning or an end point, because we don't think politics begun somewhere or ever can stop being, political. We should assume that it's a constant process of negotiating the revealing and concealing nature of truth and knowledge. And as such, as queer subjects, we should constantly navigate that and continue to disrupt any form of forgetting the ways in which
Right,
queer
so
revelations conceal the world.
In the context of that, what were your accessibility arguments then? Like,
We said that accessibility can't just be like a universal reason. You can't remove accessibility or discussions from accessibility from social location, right? We are situated through privilege in a debate space which affords us to talk about theories. Like, there's no other situation in which we could have a discussion of phenomenology of queer technology and cultural studies and social locatedness. I think it's important to recognize that and understand that just because we talk about the 1AC using certain language, that doesn't mean that that language has to be like that our strategy is reducible to that language. Like, we can learn things about queer methodologies by engaging Heidegger's abstract theoretical insight in debate and take from that specific political strategies, such as we should no longer limit immigration based on static conception.
So you make an argument about the alternative basically forcing you to perpetually come out of the closet. Kind of contextualize that argument for me.
Say the politics of the closet.
Like
modern technology is a politics which challenges forth subjects to reveal themselves in terms of binary categories. We say that that impulse is the same one in the alternative, when the alternative forces or says that in order to be truly political, you have to reveal your history, your social location,
so
your lived history.
What are you isolating as technology? Like, I just don't understand.
What
technology?
What is technology?
Yeah, like in the context of what you're saying.
It's hegemonic thought structures. It's any form of thought that forgets the ways in which it conceals the world. Right? It forgets that there are alternate ways to read the world. Like, modern technology of the family forgets that there are non-static conceptions of the family that are excluded whenever we only think about it in terms of white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, straight relationships.
Everybody ready? We'll probably end up agreeing with many of things that the affirmative says in this debate, but the method which they approach the 1AC is fundamentally problematic. Why do we even need a reference to the law? Why is what the law thinks about my family even fucking relevant to this debate round? All of these arguments about the plan being a starting point or a lack of starting point doesn't get them out of any of our link arguments. They just prove how the app has a bad method. Everyone in this room has had or at least had a family at some point. There are resources available through the voices and social location of the people in this room. The displacement of starting point of the discussion to the law only distracts and detracts from the immense resources in this room. We have a different starting point. We think that it's better. The law does not tell us about ourselves unless we listen like the plan asks you to. Furthermore, the app cannot reconcile Heidegger's politics from the 1AC, even if they don't read his evidence. It just demonstrates the doubling argument that I don't think he has a good answer to. Their argument will need to be that Heidegger was someone who was different when he was writing his books and when he was raising his hand to salute the brutal fascist regime in history. They can't no-link this argument like they do in other debates because their no-link argument is our link argument. Their method is that one that necessitates a disconnection between what people say and who people are. This is not just about a link of how they employ Heideggerian arguments. It is a problematic method that exists throughout the 1AC. It's the same method that informs their relevance to the state, their reliance on the state, that the individual is not enough and that we need to ask the law what family means in the same divide between institutional obligations of debate and ethical subjects. I'm very much aware that they have a lot of evidence in this debate, but I don't think any of that evidence speaks to the style and performance links that we are talking about. Them saying no link only demonstrates how they can just attach social location justification of not only from Heidegger, from his theory, but also from themselves. They don't even make a mention of their family, even though we all have been members of families to some degrees, and this is problematic for a couple of reasons. It uses high theory instead of lived experience to determine our relationship, or at least our understanding of how we come to understand ourselves. This is exactly what allows the left and the right to construct our identity for us, because the speaker can detach themselves from their body. This is the ideology that puts us in the position of talking about a hegemonic interpretation of what family even means in the first place. This has a couple of impacts. One, it continues this methodological area that leads us into debates about what it is that the state gets to determine and doesn't get to how we come to understand it. For example, 4 months ago, my nephew was taken by the state because we were not able to, my nephew was taken by the state simply not because the state was deciding how it is and what the family is, but necessarily how the family operates. We wasn't able for one fucking day to provide him, to get him to school because of lack of money, and them and their construction of how the family should be and operate doesn't include those who refuse to force their nephews to walk 10 miles to school and they can't afford to get them there. This only talks about how, this only proves how the black experience is marginalized because the ass can distance themselves and not define themselves in context of these types of oppression, and that is exactly what our wise evidence indicates that necessarily turns people off to these discussions. So even if the app is one of a good method that allows for us to interrogate and utilize this space to politicize different identities, that identity would always come at the expense of the black body because they have no way to materially deal with their oppression. Him not mentioning this prison analogy that Toya makes in the 1C is pretty damn problematic because it indicates that before it is that we engage in dumbass shit like ontological questions, we must deal with the material oppression that inform the way we speak about the world, which is why the language of the oppressed must be the starting point for these conversations. They don't fucking have a starting point in 2AC, so, and that's how they describe their ass. So don't at the end of this debate let them talk about how it is that they can subsume these arguments, because in conversations that we intend to have, they are always allowed to shield themselves from it, and that is exactly what allows for us to not be able to create effective solutions that fight oppression, especially in a world in which our failure to examine our own speaking positions and leave it hidden replicate those same structures of privilege and oppression that allows for us to even have these conversations. Campbell says in 1997 that a person in a privileged speaking position has a political and ethical responsibility to interrogate his or her relationship to subordinated and disadvantaged people and declare their interests. Refusing to declare one's speaking position constitutes not only a flagrant denial of privilege, effective speech, but must be considered as an act of complexity to systematically mislead. It is important to come clean about my speaking position, knowledge, standpoint, and interest. Before I speak, I'm required to undertake a process of self-examination to scrutinize my representation of politics, to immerse myself in a self-reflexive interrogation to discern what my representation of politics authorizes and exactly who it erases. Now, they make these arguments about how we're all privileged. Yes, we fucking agree we're in outrounds of the NDT, but that does not get to the question of what the hell do we do with that privilege and how it is that we confront and interact with each other in this privileged space, which ultimately means that the way in which we construct our arguments provides you a stylistic and a methodological disadvantage to their approach, because it doesn't give the oppressor way to deal with their material oppression, and doesn't even go so far. He doesn't even 2AC talk about Toya's experience, and this is ultimately how they get to shield themselves from it. The 1AC is the story of how it is that the dialogue between Toya's mother, when Toya asked the question of her mother, like, why is it that the state always gets to say fuck me, and I don't ever see the effects of what they say that are doing, and then her mother then responds with her personal narrative saying of how the state is in there doing what they have always done, making sure that their families eat, making sure that they're never miss a meal. That type of ideology and that type of reference is only replicated by the affirmative because they don't have to define themselves in the context of how it is that we situate these discussions, especially in the context of how we interact with people. You don't need a fucking piece of evidence, nor do you need a pen and a piece of paper to understand that the way in which we relate to individuals inside the debate space is a fucked up one. And even if we have productive conversations in them spaces, if those conversations are not accessible, it leads to the same type of politics that allows us to have these conversations about why it is the United States federal government gets to decide who the family is. The act doesn't need a plain text in this debate. That has been our entire argument. Their relationship to the estate only re-entrenches the ideology that we need to depend on the state to see how it is that we reflect ourselves. Sure, race is a socially constructed identification, but it's ultimately how it is that I come to interpret that identification and how it is that which turns the way in which I see myself, which means that their intersectionality arguments may be good, but they don't access those intersectionality arguments because even their own Manning evidence says that in order to connect the dots of ontology and the law of the United States, we must necessarily look at lived experiences as a window to how it is that we come to understand that, which is why your ballot in this debate is not one that is to affirm the ontological existence, or I don't even know what the hell the app is, but it is today, in terms of the negative, is going to situate yourself as per our fashioning and chant evidence indicates, is to not succumb to the institutional demands of our personal lives, to believe that we need to rely on other individuals to speak our reality to us when our perspective screams the truth about our experiences and gives you insight to how it is that we experience oppression on a day-to-day basis. The app is one that commodifies and interprets those perspectives for us, which allow for them to fill in those perspectives for the black voice. They become the black voice in terms of the affirmative, and the permutation is only a way in which they commodify those things, because in the debate about method, what fucking sense does it make to say that we can do both methods at the same time? That is irrelevant. It's about the way in which we start this conversation in the world in which they don't defend a starting point. Damn it, we'll be asked in this debate. You should affirm the voices of those who live experience on a day-to-day basis and experience that form of violence, because it's only within that voice that you can find the tools able to break down the system that allows for their voices to be commodified in the status quo, and that's what a ballot negative affirms.
All right, so at what point in time can a methodology of lived experience address structural and institutional problems?
Oh shit, I think the 1NC was a good example of how lived experience can come to change the ways in which communities operate, i.e. like Kansas City, Toya's mother works for the city, she works for the state, but yet she still finds herself...
I'm talking about the debate itself. How can a discussion of the ways in which structures oppress people? I mean, an immigrant who is denied a visa based on not being considered an immediate family relative. Our Hawthorne evidence gives the example.
Hold on. You just said about the debate space, and then you talk about immigrants who's not getting visas. Those are two separate different things.
Well, the debate space can speak to speak about these things.
Okay, so what's the question?
How can a methodology? How does your methodology account at what point in time can it approach the state?
Can it approach the state? Well, one, it doesn't look at the state as one that can tell you what their identity is. We don't preclude going to the state, but one that says that you need to start from the perspective of the self and how it is that we come to live our experience.
All right. How does an immigrant who cannot bring their significant other that's queer in say, state, you can't define my identity?
Excuse me?
You said we should not say that the state can define our identity. Tell me how a queer individual that is here, who has a significant other in another country, can say, state, you can't define my identity, even though you've destroyed my family.
It's because we give power to the state and give the state the credence that you are able to then define it. The state doesn't get its power because it is the state. We give it power by giving it the credence to define that in the status quo.
Now, how does, I want to understand this giving credence to the state. I don't understand how a linguistic mentioning or something like that can give credence. It seems to me that credence is a process of giving authority. How do you give authority to the state? How does that process occur?
When you say that when you say shit like the state is able to do things because of, like, I don't know, I didn't rephrase the question. Shit. I have an answer. I just don't know.
How does the process of giving authority to the state occur?
How does it? Because we legitimize the state and say that it does have this power. That's how it came to be in the first place. To us to believe,
so it's a question.
Even going back in history, for us to believe that there was this unifying.
So it's a question.
All
right, that's cool.
Yeah.
All right, you make reference to these stylistic disads and accessibility arguments. What is the bright line for? Well, I just don't understand how you can say that a certain speaking style doesn't have a stylistic strategy.
Excuse me?
How can something not be stylistic?
It cannot be stylistically aesthetically pleasing in the context of the people of color and accessibility, i.e. the wise evidence. It talks about the fact that people of color don't aesthetically come to appreciate or find themselves able to engage in.
But how do you know that?
Obviously disadvantaged.
It's obviously not something objective that you can, kind of diagnose.
I think your research arguments kind of speak to this. When we prioritize notions of research over the lived experience, it excludes the people who have no ability to interact because all they have is their lived experience in the context of your ontology. Excuse me?
Then why do you read evidence?
I'll take you up on a debate in a moment about why I read evidence. I need a couple seconds. Everybody. Okay. This debate is about debating methodological exclusion perpetuated by the negative team to prop up the messages of power that leave oppression, exclusion, and structural violence intact. Your balance should be in favor of the team with the best method of engagement and scholarship. On that question in this space, you vote affirmative for a couple reasons. Number one, if we didn't have a link before, the permutation definitely gives us one now. The permutation cannot solve the reason to vote negative. They say the permutation uses their method to prevent the current social method of ontology from inverting what it seeks to take over and to perpetuate in the ways that it perpetuates oppression. But they highly undercover our arguments about the black body. Their sovereignty mechanism is predicated on the revealing and the concealing of identity without realizing that the black body does not have that option. A queer understanding of being or even a family is one that assumes that things like race are queerable to all people. By ignoring the way that the state approaches the black family and the black psyche, they become the inverted ontology that prioritizes their perception of ontology over the oppressed perception of ontology. Things like race cannot be transcended by ontology because no matter how much the way we understand ourselves becomes queer, our black bodies make us uniquely unqueer and very identifiable. Ultimately, this proves why the permutation won't solve because they turn into the type of normative politics that essentially excludes or overlooks or whitewashes the experiences of black people and how they come to understand and are integrated in their conceptualization of what it means to be in the first place. This is why our criticism combined with their normative advocacy short circuits the mood of real transformation since film in the 99. Many scholars assume that these tools can be used as legitimate means for achieving goals justified either as systemically objective or determined through some neutral process. Postmodern scholars are questioning the normative goal they argue were never objectively neutral, determined rather are substantive ends of legal processes that reflect distinctive cultural values and social positions. Some modern scholars are partially accepted this postmodern insight, yet these scholars in the end always somehow reach a modest conclusion. Often through some sleight of the hand, they give a particular result objectively desirable or justified. Thus, they manage to avoid the most troubling aspects of postmodern theory, such as the pervasiveness of power that domesticate postmodern insights put into the toolbox and be used and taken out only when needed. This is impacted by the, did you read the Campbell evidence? The Campbell evidence that talks about the representational politics that exists. When we allow for the pervasiveness of power to prevail in the context of how it is that we orient our politics, we allow for our politics, even though on the onset they might look like they grapple with notions of black identity, they really don't because their representational politics, once internalized by those who are oppressed, become to understand that they don't reveal any place for me to stand. So in the context of my narrative, in the context of where it is we find the black people, where are the black people? The black people don't exist in the world in which they sought for notions of family, which means that my family will never be helped and never be assisted. I cannot internalize what they said and take it back to my family and help them to understand and deal with these structural limitations of what it means to be a family in the context of the black body. They give you no methodology for grappling with that, which is why permutation is going to be problematic in this debate. This is why we have the right and the obligation to force them to recognize their social location out of the 1AC because we, again, don't get that option. This is why accessibility is so important. Why I contextualize this by talking about the fact that people are turned off from their forms of conversation. Number one, when we prioritize the notion of research without joining it with the lived experience. That is the demanding evidence that they read that facilitates and isolates the fact that this has to be this is the impetus of your methodology and how it is you come to understand and interact with other people. This is further impacted by Jarvis in 2K when he says, it is right that we engage in an ontological debate, but to support this, that is the only task, let alone the most important one. Smacks of intellectual elitism and displays contempt for those who search for guidance in their daily struggle. For people who search in their daily struggle, least in these types of conversations. How does it help to solve the plight of the poor, the displaced refugees, the casualties of war? To support the problem-solving technical theory is in some way bad. A consumptuous position that abrogates any hope of solving some of the nightmarish realities that millions confront daily. We need to ask these theories, so what? In a sense, in what sense can this debate toward a bottomless pit of epistemology and metaphysics can be just pertinent to anyone other than those foolish enough to be scholastically excited by the abstract and debate? A post-structural approach fails to empower the marginalized and abandons them. This ultimately impacts for you how it is that we situate this in the context of structural violence. If on my day-to-day I have to come to understand the ways in which my experience, the lack of food, the lack of a place of refuge, the fact that my nephew is not at home and I get home from my own classes every single day at school, how do I rejoin that and find some type of rejoinder in their methodology? methodology, that's one that doesn't account for the marginalized people, that their methodology essentially overlooks because it becomes a conversation with privileged people from privileged people with privileged people about the oppressed people instead of giving them a hand in their liberation themselves. And again, I have no way of internalizing their method in the context of how situated in my own life, which is something that they cannot access, which is why our method of talking about things, these aspects are going to be better because ours is the only one that actually interrogates notions of education acknowledged in the way in which it's constructed to actually spill over into the real world. First of all, you prefer education for a couple reasons. First, we find perspectives on the topic because we value education at the same threshold of knowledge. Meaningful education is a product of the convergence of the arbitrary and the organic coexistence between experience and research that enhances the ability of the other. To truly expand one's notion of knowledge, the education they receive must be coexistent with that knowledge of both rules and sustainability beyond the education. Secondly, only our education has uniqueness, and that uniqueness helps to reshape the way we interpret the notion of beasts and their function in everyday society. Realizing that beasts in their current form essentially exclude from the inside allows for us to interrogate how we interact with those who have migrated to debate and to this country from many places. Lastly, only our type of education has a reality spillover in both the debate and physical worlds. Our framework listen to recognition that the world fronts people inside debate and vice versa until we can restructure the very foundations of how we discuss issues of social importance. The absence of the stories that accompany the people we try to help be the reasons no change ever occurs. So ultimately, if their representational politics is one that truly interrogates the black body, then we have to come to understand their representational politics from their social location, which is why social location is so important, because until I understand your motive from the neighborhood that I come from, I can't trust you. I can't engage in your method because I don't know where it is that how it is that you coming at me, and that's something that they cannot solve for. The fact that their abstraction from the black psyche, from that prison within a prison within a prison within a prison, is a world in which they don't have the key to unlock me, and when they don't have the key to unlock me, I'm forgotten. I am made invisible. My social location is forgotten, and my structural violence is perpetuated in the world in which they don't engage in that level of our arguments. Essentially, we have debate disads and stylistic disads about the way in which they come to confront these things, because I guarantee you the rhetorical package of the 1AC versus the rhetorical package of the 1AC is one that to be better situated in my community is the best way to come to understand my oppression and deal with the things that I see on the everyday. So it is the talk test that they must pass in the context of oppression, and those who are oppressed, those who need to be liberated. Who's affirmative or who's constructive would you most likely present?
Our role without is to activate agency in this debate round to interrupt the hegemonic ontology of the family that we as micro-knowledge producers are necessarily responsible for within our privileged position within the academia and the syllabus. It's very similar to the conclusion of their Campbell argument. He concludes, I mentioned them as signposts, they need more clarity. A commitment to empowerment necessitates a commitment to combating injustice in all its forms and requires from each of us a constant re-examination and reflexivity of both theory and practice to ask daily what we are doing. We agree with the majority of their arguments about how we come to understand identity. However, they have not answered our understanding, which is that not only does materiality shape identity, but in fact the way that we interact with the world is also shaped by how we think about it. If a majority of people come to tell you that your family is X, that way of telling someone what their family is necessarily comes to reflect their own self-imagination, which is why we as academics have to interrupt that dominant conflation of the family. The white heteronormative understanding of what the family is. There is very little discussion of the family in the UNC other than, well, you didn't talk about your family, which we'll be answered on later, but they have not answered our argument about the immigrant. There is very little discussion of what the immigrant is in the context of the FQC. That we are responsible for the knowledge we produce about immigration, our Burke evidence as well as our garlic evidence is all very good about the way that knowledge coalesces within academia to produce macro skills dissolution. Means this is why we have to talk about the law. We do not construct the USFG as a monolithic entity that actually engages with activity instead ignoring the law. Rather, we believe that we as individuals producing a certain form of knowledge about the family is what produces the effect, like I explained across the 1AC of the law, which is exactly whenever immigrants cannot come into the country because they either are not the correct sexual identity or they are not part of the correct family, which necessarily reinforces a heteronormative nuclear family. It's very easy. This means that their argument is far more privileged when they can say that you should just ignore the state, just don't give power to the state. How do you not give power to the state other than the affirmative by trying to interrupt the ways in which the state can ultimately deploy the dominant knowledge that we have constructed in order to police the heteronormative body? It's not so simple to just say I'm going to ignore the state and come in because of the border, you'll get shot in the face. Also, their Heidegger argument was totally, their argument of the proof that Heidegger was different actually is true. This is why all of their arguments are a fear of co-option. Their argument is a fear of commodification. They are afraid that they had framed the 1AC according to that we are the oppressors, that Heidegger is the oppressors, which precludes the ability to ever fundamentally cooperate. This uniquely true. This creates oppositional politics and incentivizes the inability to actually allow people to change. Actually, Heidegger's law did change because he originally thought that the deferential will was good. We should just give ourselves up to the community. Instead, the later Heidegger said that no, the deferential will is just as bad as the original will. That is the disjunctionist thought. He also over-prioritizes the ontological. While we believe that the ontological and the material commitment, which is our explanation of this, the explanation of that argument, they also necessarily they also what is that argument? That's fine. The style argument doesn't actually make any sense. We said no link, that's fine. However, not only do they make linking impact arguments, the one that made a uniqueness argument, and I'm pretty sure they were the only people in the debate that have read a Jarvis card. They engage in method debate practices that make a lot more sense than us saying the words the United States government. We are not Whitman, we are not Emory WW. We have made a lot of specific arguments about how we should read our plain text in this particular way because we resolved that we read a piece of evidence that frames that. Also, I don't need to talk about my, there's no reason why I should be able to talk about my family. I've got my family right there, which proves that family always shapes your social location, but I don't necessarily need to talk about how we shape my social location because you necessarily don't have a right to force me to do that. Instead, we also, that's our fourth presence thing, DA. The alternative necessarily is intolerant of those who don't believe in social location. It's proved above every few impacts the point is violence towards difference, their intolerance to the other who refuses to oppress themselves and frames them as either oppressed or oppressed. Our candle evidence indicates this hatred of the unknown, the psyche of the other, preconfigures totalitarian politics that is irreducible to racism because it manifests all out violence, just like the war in Iraq. We redefine terrorism to include those who are against American occupation. This is true, the negative is not the military, but our entire point is that we need to be attentive to the ways in which our knowledge can be produced and commodified by larger structures and be redeployed in ways we're not observing. The piece of point is they reinforce heteronormativity. They are the consular, demanding that we come out of the closet and admit our identity. This act of ontological violence is intolerant. Those in the middle, they fundamentally de-queer identity, leaving no space for the hermaphrodite of the permutation, the plain text, etc. This means that when the one they see other student solidarity with them or perpetuate racism, this is intolerance of those who don't know when or what racism is or how they are affected by racism, or possibly queer immigrants who can't bring the significant other in but don't experience racism. Our strategy is one of the immigrant who refuses to reveal their identity and closes off the power of the immigrant. They're the panoptic gaze. They refuse to gaze to technology, which they have no answer to. If we refuse to gaze whenever we have that ability to, that is a way for us to reveal one strategy while not concealing other people's strategies. That is how the permutation operates. It's also what I link to their Campbell evidence because we admit our privilege as debaters and we admit our privilege in U.S. academia, but it's something that we are much more attentive to than they are, which is why we have to speak in a particular academic context. This is why we don't read our 1AC people on the street. We read our 1AC in front of debaters who will know what we're talking about. We have to be attentive to our academic audience so that we cannot just make universalizing claims about what everybody should do. And it's our Kramer-Dahl evidence, sort of universalization allows for us to speak for others, which is why we don't mention Toya's story and the 2AC. We cannot speak for what you should do because your historical situation is necessarily particularized. And also we agree with their expression of identity. That was split up. It's a question of how they apply their method to us. Also their norm conceded that lived experiences co-constituted. This split up. We also do not fill in the black voice. We ignore the revealing concealing argument made above answers their fill in black voice. Like we're not trying to fill them in. We allow the black body to be and say that both strategies necessarily are particularized, which is why they cannot be universal. Our Miller evidence also indicates that it actually is possible for the black body to reveal concealing. The good example that he gives is in interracial couple. They have certain privileges, i.e. they would be able to be married because they are heterosexual, but they might be stigmatized by not being able to get into certain restaurants. It's the question of social location that determines what type of identity they are interpolated by. Interpolation is in framing, which is why we have to understand the particular social situations that give rise to the things that we are inframed by. Their argument about how there's no possibility for the black body to have access to ontology is denied by the Princess Phenomenon. An example, in cross-examination, that the black body does have the accessibility, and also is denied by our argument that was made above, about how we have the possibility to necessarily think in different ways and revealing consent, etc. Also, the permutation does not mean that we are trying to incorporate your strategy. I want to make this very clear. It means revealing concealing means that different social strategies and different people's social situatedness necessarily entails particularized strategies. We should not make universal pedagogical claims about what everybody should do. We are only speaking about the responsibility that Nick and I have as debaters on the immigration topic and outroutes of the NDT to produce certain types of knowledge.
Good to have.
Everybody ready? This debate is about debating in a world in which they concede that you would lose this debate round. Their method of interrogating the dominant ontology is one that doesn't even engage in and impose the same ontological inversion it tries to tear down. They ignore and whitewash the perspectives and experience of the black body in juxtaposition with the state, which means that their method cannot solve itself, let alone the alternative. This essentially proves the permutation won't solve, which is they're only out in this round. They have no offensive answers to those who can queer their identity because of the dominant ontology. They predicate all of their offense on the option to reveal and conceal, which speaks directly to the warrants of the Jarvis evidence and forces you to look at the Campbell evidence as an interrogation of their representational politics and who it authorizes and exactly who it erases, because it would always be the black body while they are on their ontological quest to understand excluded families that their ass does nothing for. I go back to my family with no method to deal with the oppression on the day-to-day. This gives you inroads to our accessibility accessibility arguments from the wise evidence because I am turned off by this scholarship. I have no way to access my own liberation, and their normative forms of intellectual and interrogation becomes bankrupt in its material advantages. This is why the social location is so important in a world of structural violence, because it must be confronted out of the rhetorical package of the 1AC. Even if there is a risk of violence to the queer outside of debate, it begs the question of whether we should be allowed to be violent to the black body inside of the debate space. They recognize privilege but don't go far enough if they do not use the recognition that ruptures the status quo, which is why our Feldman evidence gives you two disads to their pseudo-permutation. One is the fact that we will always end up coming back to these same questions if we don't interrogate the way in which the system isolates these forms of voices and tell those voices that they are not useful or particular, which leads to the second disad, which is tools in the toolbox that ultimately commodifies and tells those voices how it is that they're supposed to interpret their own existence. This is ultimately the argument that he cold right conceded in the 1AR about how it is that I say that they allow for you to fill in the narrative for those people when they say that they want to be invisible. Our argument has been, and our entire performance in this debate has been, that we are speaking out, saying that we want to hear the ways in which people relate to these things, but we are never responded to, which is why you cannot vote for an act that gives people no way to access this ontological investigation due to their structural material conditions. Lived experience in this instance is what we need to understand oppression, especially per the Hinds evidence that indicates the oppressed themselves need to have a hand in their own liberation strategies. They must be able to share their experiences without being commodified. Now, the black body is one that can never access it due to the black psyche. And this also feeds to the argument talk about how it is that we don't talk about the immigrant. What the fuck do you mean? You can't trace me. I am always displaced. There's no recognized tribe by the United States for me to trace my lineage. We are the fucking immigrant. We are the people who migrate to the debate community and say that we need to incorporate our perspectives, but we are always told that our incorporating our perspectives will lead to some type of fucking violence. But the violence comes from the fact that you try to diminish those voices and control what those voices say and how it is they operate, which leads to this doubling argument that I'm still not sure they come to deal with, to say that we can separate our personal and professional identities, which is why he says that, well, we don't read our 1AC to people on the street, we read it in the debate round. That's the exact problem that disconnects the fact that that leads to the fictionality of debate rounds, to where we can't take shit inside of here into the way in which we actualize oppression. Listen, if I don't have food, if I don't have water, if I don't have the means to be able to do those things, how the fuck do I engage in your ontological oppression? The accent of this recognition shows that shows the fact that the state not only gets to control what the family is, but also how the family operates. This was the argument, well, not necessarily the argument, but the perspectives I shared with you about my nephew. It wasn't that the state was able to tell me what my family is. They were able to manipulate how it is my family operates and say that the way in which the black family operates is not a productive one and shouldn't be allowed. And their affirmative doesn't even get to that. It just questions whether or not what can be a family. Now, our Jarvis evidence even contextualized this by saying that this approach on ontology is what forecloses the possibility for debate rounds and academia itself to be open to how it is that we can construct methods that allow for us to deal with oppression. They method would necessarily say you go to those school rallies and just stand up in there and say nothing without going up to the registration center saying that I don't have the money to get my kids school supplies. You have to disclose that in order to receive the material aspects of it, which shows how our form of education that we provide is one that is reciprocal and not only asks that we give, but it also necessitates that we receive an acknowledgement which liberates the black experience and how it is that the black psyche becomes condemned and marginalized, which is ultimately how the arguments that I make about how communities joining communities together is one that is good, but you can only have authentic communities if we are able to express how it is that we come to engage in this. Our Hinds evidence provides you the starting point, not for the universal, but this particular debate, and says that understanding the perspectives of those who experience oppression must be the starting point in order for us to have some form of coalitional politics that truly ruptures the dominant narrative of the status quo, or they can just stand outside and just say that, oh, my family's over there, so I don't need to talk about it. That's bullshit, especially when we are interacting together in this debate and we're asking for you to share your experiences. And even if they employed these arguments about social location, that was not in the 1AC, which means that the method that they engage in is one that necessitates the erasure of the black body, which is the status quo.
themselves to actualize queer methodology through dissenting against the hegemonic forms of thought as outlined by the 1AC, to speak out against and read against the grain, the ways in which the debate community, the resolution has become overdetermined by the static conception of the family that has overdetermined and disallowed the immigrant to be outside of such hegemonic structures. Our Burke evidence is the lens through which you should understand all of their state links and what is a productive strategy. Our Burke evidence indicates that rational and macro level exclusions are the direct result of the coalescing of hegemonic structures of thought. Whenever those forms of thought forget the inevitable concealing that comes with new revelations and new forms of knowledge inside the world. This makes perfect sense in the context of our Manning and our Garlic evidence that says that in the context of sexual politics and queer methodology, that such a stance of revealing and concealing is absolutely necessary in order to understand that identity doesn't have anything essential to it, and that trying to reduce it to some type of essential or binary category always results in the becoming hybrid of identity, and thus the withdrawal from their control. Our permutation is not the traditional permutation of a straight combination of the two methodologies, but is viewing the alternative through the lens of queer theory and the recognition of revealing and concealing. The 1AR is very good on the question of why their dialectic construction of their strategy is solely focusing on lived experience conceals other methods and ways. They have conceded that a strategy for a black body that is marked in a fundamentally different way than a queer body is not the same thing, and only the permutation allows those two bodies to be in their separate social lividness, which doesn't inframe the black body to the same social understanding as the queer body. The 1AR argument about interpolation. Our Morse evidence indicates that revealing and concealing is necessary to understand the intersectional nature of oppression. It cannot be reduced to a race or class or sexuality, but that bodies can be marked simultaneously by both visible and invisible markings. That an interracial couple feels oppression based on their bodies being marked racially, but also exerts an invisible oppression over those queer couples that cannot experience things like marriage. Only the permutation allows us to negotiate those things without universalizing them. Now, the fact that the permutation is a constant process, doesn't have a starting point or an endpoint, is not a link, but an answer to their first piece of link evidence. It's in the conclusion to their own piece of Campbell evidence, which indicates that we have to constantly negotiate methodologies to prevent them from calcifying instead of universalizing them and understanding them only in one way. Second of all, is that we don't link to the second piece of evidence. Our Kramer et al. Evidence indicates that we should not understand ourselves as sovereign egos standing over and above the other and being able to tell them the strategy or the methodology which will work for them in their social location. And likewise, this is a direct double turn with the top framing of the 2NR when he says that the link is that we do not allow them to take back home our strategy. That's precisely the point. We don't attempt to tell them a strategy to work with, but give them a methodology through which we can understand the different ways that political strategies simultaneously conceal the world and then forget it. Now, the impact of this is that they linked their own style arguments, which is a particular and a specific articulation of the depoliticized nature of concealing whenever you're able to drape it in essentialized terms, that they are the form of doubling because they can read the Jarvis evidence and at the same time accuse us from doing debate techne. They can read fast and then accuse us for doing the same things. Our evidence indicates that ontology is necessary in the context of queerness, which is more specific than their Jarvis evidence. Jarvis evidence, which takes out the internal link into their arguments. Now, theirs is worse because they depoliticize it by charging us with doubling. We can recognize the ways in which our reading of the plan text both utilize traditional notions of the debate and charges them with an uncanny sense of taking them out of their original context. Thus, our reading of the plain text was premised by our understanding of resolve, which doesn't understand the state as something in frame, and in fact was directly followed by our Burke evidence, which indicates that the state is an affect. Now, the accessibility argument, their Campbell evidence indicates that people of power, people in the place of power, have to relate their privilege and come to terms with it if they're speaking to people who are disenfranchised. However, the 2NR does not come to terms with the privilege of being in debate. They have conceded and forgotten that we are situated in debate, and that privilege structures all bodies inside of this room. This is a specific articulation of why there is no distinction between the ontic and the ontological in terms of queerness. The 1AR explanation of interpolation makes perfect sense here, that we can be thrown into a material situation that disenfranchises and allows for beings to be excluded from the country based on economic means, but that ontology mediates how we interact with those strategies. Now, the permutation necessary to prevent a strategy of forced presencing, which allows for the alternative to be co-opted into modern manifestations of technology and doesn't allow the queer body to be. The permutation opens up the possibility for the queer immigrant to now reveal itself to the consular as a strategy of frustration of the technological gaze, which challenges forced bodies and forces them to presence themselves in terms of binary and dialectical inversion. This is why the negative leads to a metaphysical inversion. The Sayre dialectic, instead of challenging the way that modern politics separates the body from social experience, they overdetermine the social experience, which disenfranchises and disallows the queer. The permutation is also necessary to prevent to allow for coalitional politics, as they've conceded that the fear of commodification creates oppositional politics in which we constantly fracture each other instead of looking for ways and continuities between each other.